The detail that stayed with me in this story was not the empty chair across the table. It was the small silver key placed beside a restaurant receipt at 10:47 that night. After a man had paid for an anniversary dinner, he finished alone and quietly altered the shape of the life he had been building for two people. You're watching Diary of Owen. Let's go back to the table where those plans began to change. The light above our booth flickered every 43 seconds. I noticed because I had been looking at the same brass pendant for nearly 10 minutes, counting the intervals between its brief dimming and return. It hung low over the center of the table at Bellwether House, a narrow restaurant on Lorne Street with dark green walls, linen napkins, and a row of rain-streaked windows facing the old tram depot. At 8:16 p.m., the pendant dulled again. Across from me, my wife Elise was reading a message beneath the edge of the table. She held her phone with both hands angled toward her lap, the glow washing the underside of her chin pale blue. Her wineglass stood untouched beside her right wrist. A thin crescent of lipstick marked the rim from the single sip she had taken when we arrived. It was our 11th wedding anniversary. We had been seated at 7:32. The reservation was under my name, booked 14 weeks in advance. I had requested booth 7 because it was the same booth where we had eaten after signing the papers on our first house. Back then, we had split one dessert because the closing costs had left us with $48 in our checking account. That night, 11 years later, there was a small wrapped box in the inside pocket of my jacket. It contained a key. Not jewelry, not a watch. A key to a cottage Elise had spent 3 summers describing without knowing I had found one. The cottage stood 32 miles north of the city on the edge of Lake Marrow, with cedar siding, a narrow dock, and 2 bedrooms beneath a sloped roof. The kitchen needed work. The back steps leaned 6 degrees to the left. A maple tree had pushed one section of the stone path upward by nearly 3 inches. I knew every defect. I also knew the shape of the morning light in the upstairs bedroom, the exact distance from the porch to the water, and the sound the screen door made when it closed. I knew because I was a municipal planner, and because I had spent 22 years learning that every future begins as a series of measured conditions. People like to imagine that plans were made of ambition. Most plans were made of drainage maps, zoning restrictions, loan terms, and the willingness to look closely at what might fail. Elise had always said she loved that about me. She said I could walk into a room and see not only what it was, but what it might become. At 8:19, she looked up from her phone and smiled too quickly. She said, "Sorry, work." I nodded. Elise worked as a client development director for a medical design firm called Vale and Heron. Her job involved travel, presentations, dinners with hospital executives, and the cultivation of relationships that often lasted years before producing a contract. For most of our marriage, I had respected the patience her work required. She could remember the name of a client's daughter 6 months after a single conversation. She knew who preferred tea, who disliked early meetings, who needed figures first and stories second. She understood that people rarely said what they wanted directly. We were alike in that way. We both studied what was not being said. The difference was that I had started pretending not to see it. The waiter arrived with our second course, placing a bowl of saffron risotto in front of Elise and a plate of roasted halibut before me. His name was Matteo. He had served us twice before. He remembered that Elise did not like sparkling water and that I always asked for lemon. He wished us a happy anniversary. Elise thanked him without meeting his eyes. When he left, she moved a piece of risotto around her bowl with the side of her fork. I asked whether something was wrong. She said she had a headache. I said we could leave. She said no, she wanted to stay. Her phone vibrated again. This time, it was on the table. The screen lit for less than 2 seconds, but I saw the name. Julian. No surname. Just Julian, followed by a preview of 5 words. I'm parked around the corner. The pendant above us dimmed. 43 seconds had passed. I did not ask who Julian was. Not then. That was not because I was afraid of the answer. It was because I already knew enough to understand that asking would not change the geometry of the room. There are moments when a structure reveals its failure all at once. A crack appears in a wall, but the crack is not the beginning. It is only the first visible evidence of pressure that has been accumulating behind paint and plaster for years. The truth does not arrive when the damage begins. It arrives when the damage can no longer be disguised. Elise and I met when I was 31 and she was 29. It was raining that evening too. We were at a public consultation meeting in the basement of a library on Marin Avenue, where residents had come to object to a proposed bus corridor. I was representing the city. Elise was there on behalf of a rehabilitation clinic that would be affected by the construction schedule. She spoke for 4 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not repeat herself. She pointed out that the proposed temporary stop would require patients with limited mobility to cross 6 lanes of traffic during the winter. She was right. I revised the recommendation the next morning. 2 weeks later, she sent an email thanking me for listening. I replied that listening was part of the job. She wrote back that it was supposed to be. We had coffee 3 days after that. Our first date lasted 5 hours. Elise had a way of making attention feel like warmth. When she looked at you, she did not glance past your shoulder or prepare her next sentence. She stayed. I remember thinking that she had the rare ability to make a person feel selected from the world. For the first few years, she gave that attention to me. We rented an apartment above a tailor shop on Westcott Road. The pipes rattled at 5:40 every morning when the owner downstairs turned on his pressing equipment. The bedroom window faced an alley, and the kitchen floor dipped near the refrigerator. We were happy there, not in the polished way people describe happiness afterward, but in the ordinary way that makes happiness believable. We argued about laundry. We burned dinners. We watched documentaries halfway through and fell asleep on the sofa. On Sunday mornings, Elise made coffee while I drew imaginary renovations on graph paper. She would lean over my shoulder and move walls with the tip of her finger. "Put the bedroom here," she would say. "More windows there. A porch facing west." She wanted water nearby. Not necessarily the ocean. A lake would do. She wanted a place where the city could not follow us. When we married, we could not afford that life. We could barely afford the life we had. Our wedding cost $6,800, including the dress, the restaurant, and the photographer who lost half the photographs when a memory card failed. We spent our honeymoon in a borrowed cabin beside a quarry because Elise's aunt knew the owner. There were mosquitoes in the bedroom and no hot water after 9. Elise said it was perfect. For a long time, I believed we were both the kind of people who could make a small life feel complete while we worked toward a larger one. We bought our house in year 4. It was a narrow brick semi on Harlan Street with a shared driveway and a backyard small enough to mow in 11 minutes. We renovated slowly. I rebuilt the pantry. Elise chose the tile for the upstairs bathroom. We planted rosemary along the back fence, though the soil was too wet and half of it died. Every improvement became a joint decision. Every decision seemed to confirm that we were moving in the same direction. The cottage entered our conversations during the summer of our 7th year. We had rented a place on Lake Merrow for 5 nights. The cabin had warped floors, 2 chipped mugs, and a dock that dipped below the water if both of us stood at the end. On the 3rd morning, Elise sat on the steps with a blanket around her shoulders and said she wanted this someday. Not the cabin exactly, the stillness, the ability to wake up and see water before seeing a screen. I asked when someday was. She said before we were too old to swim without complaining. I laughed. She did not. She said she was serious. So I began to calculate. Our salaries, our mortgage, the likely cost of replacing the Harlan Street roof, projected property taxes, the amount we could save if we stayed in the house 5 more years and avoided buying new cars. I built a spreadsheet with 12 tabs. Elise called it the Lake Plan. At first, she contributed to it. She transferred $700 each month into a savings account. I transferred $900. Bonuses went in when we could manage it. We stopped taking expensive vacations and drove north instead. By our 9th anniversary, the account held $68,000. By our 10th, it held $104,000. The cottage I had found cost $489,000. The seller was a retired geography teacher named Sylvia Crew. She had owned it for 37 years and wanted it to go to someone who would not tear it down. I had visited the property 3 times. The first time was with the listing agent. The second was with an inspector. The third was alone. I stood on the dock for 20 minutes while light moved across the water. I imagined Elise there, in a blue sweater, carrying 2 cups of coffee. I imagined repainting the bedroom with her. I imagined the future not as a dramatic change, but as a sequence of quiet mornings we had earned. I made an offer 6 weeks before our anniversary. Sylvia accepted on the condition that closing occur in December. The mortgage approval was complete. The inspection had identified no structural defects beyond the back steps and some aging wiring in the utility room. I had planned to give Elise the key after dessert. The key was ceremonial. The real documents were in my briefcase at home. Both our names were intended for the title. At 8:23, Elise set down her fork. She said, "I need to go." I looked at her. Her face had changed since the message appeared. The muscles around her mouth were tense, but her eyes were bright with a kind of urgency I had not seen directed at me in months. I asked whether it was work. She pressed her napkin once against her lips. She said Julian was having a difficult night. There are sentences that contain more information than the speaker intends. That was one of them. Not a client. Not a colleague. Julian. A person whose difficult night required my wife to leave our anniversary dinner before the main course had been cleared. I asked who he was. She looked toward the window. Rain slid down the glass in wavering vertical lines. Outside, headlights passed slowly through the intersection, stretching white across the wet pavement. She said he was someone from work. I asked whether someone from work knew she was at our anniversary dinner. She said yes. I asked whether he had still asked her to come. She did not answer immediately. At 8:25, the pendant dimmed again. She said, "He needs me." I remember the sensation in my hands. They became very cold. The room itself remained warm. I could feel heat from the radiator beneath the window against my left leg, but my fingers lost their temperature as though blood had been redirected elsewhere. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then I placed both hands flat on the tablecloth and looked at the woman I had married. She had worn a dark red dress I bought her 2 birthdays earlier. A small thread had come loose near the right cuff. Her earrings were silver circles. I had watched her put them on in our bedroom mirror at 6:48 that evening. She had asked whether they looked too plain. I had said they looked like her. At the time, she smiled. Now she reached for her coat. I asked if she loved him. Her hand stopped on the back of the chair. She said, "Owen." She used my name the way people do when they want the name itself to serve as a warning. I waited. She sat down again, but only on the edge of the seat. She said it was complicated. I said, "Most things are." She looked at the table. Then she said, she had not meant for tonight to happen this way. That sentence was the first honest thing she said. Not because she admitted the affair. She did not. Not yet. But she acknowledged that tonight had a shape before I became aware of it. There had been intentions, arrangements, expectations. Julian was parked around the corner because he expected her to leave with him. She had either invited him or failed to discourage him. Neither explanation preserved our marriage. I asked how long. She rubbed her thumb against the edge of her wedding ring. She said 6 months. I knew that was not the whole answer. People often choose the length of a betrayal based on the last point at which they can still recognize themselves. 6 months meant something had happened 6 months earlier that she was willing to name. It did not mean nothing had happened before. I asked whether she was leaving me. She said she did not know. Then she looked toward the window again, and I understood that whatever uncertainty she felt about our marriage did not extend to the next 15 minutes. She knew where she was going. She knew who was waiting. She knew she wanted to leave the restaurant and get into his car. I nodded once. I said, "Go." She looked at me then. For the first time that evening, she looked directly at me. She said she did not want to hurt me. I said, I know. It was true. Elise did not enjoy cruelty. She did not want to see me suffer. She wanted the freedom to make the choice she desired, without having to remain in the room where that choice took effect. That is not the same as kindness, but it is human. She put on her coat. The waiter approached, saw her standing, and changed direction before reaching the table. Elise picked up her handbag. She asked whether we could talk when she came home. I asked whether she intended to come home that night. She said she thought so. I said, then we can talk if I am awake. She waited, as though she expected more. An argument. A plea. A demand that she sit down. For years she had told me that my calmness made her feel safe. In that moment, I think it frightened her. She said, "You're not even going to fight for me." The words were quiet, almost disappointed. I looked at the cooling food between us. Then I said, "I thought this dinner was me fighting for us." Her expression shifted. Not dramatically. A small lowering of the eyes. A breath that did not quite become a reply. Then she left. At 8:29, the front door opened and a line of cold air moved through the restaurant. I watched her cross the pavement beneath a black umbrella. A silver car waited at the curb beyond the flower shop. The passenger door opened before she reached it. She got in. The brake lights brightened. The car pulled away. I remained seated. The pendant flickered again. 43 seconds. The waiter returned at 8:32. He asked whether everything was all right. I looked at the empty seat. I said my wife had been called away. He gave a slight nod that communicated both understanding and disbelief. He asked whether I wanted the food packed. I said no. Then I ate my dinner. That is the part people have found strange when I have told them. They expect grief to make ordinary actions impossible. Sometimes grief makes ordinary actions necessary. I cut the halibut into 6 pieces. I ate 5. The sauce had begun to skin at the edges. The potatoes were lukewarm. The asparagus still snapped when I pressed it with my fork. I drank half a glass of wine. At the table beside me, a couple in their 20s discussed apartment listings. The woman showed the man photographs on her phone. He kept enlarging the kitchens. Near the bar, someone laughed too loudly. A server dropped a spoon. The restaurant continued. There is something clarifying about watching a public room remain unchanged after your private life has split open. At 8:51, Matteo asked whether I still wanted dessert. I said yes. I ordered the pear tart Elise had chosen when we made the reservation. It arrived with a thin candle, because the restaurant had noted our anniversary. Matteo hesitated before lighting it. I told him he could. The flame bent slightly in the air from the heating vent. I did not make a wish. I let the candle burn until wax formed a small, clear pool around the wick. Then I blew it out and ate half the tart. The bill arrived at 9:14, $212.40. The restaurant had not charged for dessert. I added a $50 tip. At the bottom of the receipt, beneath the total, I wrote the date, October 17th. I folded the receipt once and placed it in my wallet. Then I removed the small wrapped box from my jacket pocket. I turned it over in my hand. The paper was cream-colored with a blue ribbon. Elise had wrapped my birthday gifts in that same paper for years. I had found a roll in the cabinet above the washing machine and used the last of it. I did not open it. I placed it beside the empty wine glass and sat there for another minute. The key inside weighed less than an ounce. The future attached to it had occupied 4 years of my thoughts. The paperwork was scheduled to be finalized at noon the following day. Until that point, the purchase agreement allowed me to alter the ownership structure. The lender had approved the mortgage based on my salary alone, because Elise's commission income varied. Her name did not need to appear on the loan. I had insisted it appear on the deed. At 9:19, I picked up the box and put it back in my pocket. Outside, the rain had softened to mist. I walked 6 blocks to the municipal parking garage. My car was on level 4, space 418. I sat behind the wheel without turning on the engine. The garage lights hummed overhead. Concrete retained the cold differently from open air. It seemed to rise from below. through the soles of my shoes. My phone showed 3 messages from Elise. The first said, "I'm sorry." The second said, "I know this is awful." The third said, "Please don't make any decisions tonight." I read them twice. Then I placed the phone face down on the passenger seat. Professionally, I had spent most of my life being paid to think about consequences before the people affected by them were aware those consequences existed. A proposed road changed property values. A new station changed foot traffic. A zoning amendment changed who could afford to remain in a neighborhood. Every choice created pressure elsewhere. My work was not to stop change. It was to understand where the pressure would travel. That night, I did not think first about divorce. I thought about ownership, not as revenge, as structure. Elise had spent months building a second relationship while continuing to participate in the first. She had remained in our home, contributed to our account, discussed the cottage, and allowed me to believe we were moving toward a shared future. She had not made a clean choice. She had preserved both possibilities. At our anniversary dinner, she chose the one waiting in the silver car. I could not control that. I could decide whether the future I had planned would remain available as a place she could return to if the other possibility disappointed her. I started the engine. At 9:41, I drove to my office. The Department of Urban Development occupied the 4th and 5th floors of a building on Calden Square. At night, the lobby smelled faintly of wet stone and copier toner. The security guard, Darius, looked up when I entered. He asked whether I had forgotten something. I said I had paperwork to finish. He waved me through. My office overlooked the courthouse roof and a row of plane trees. The leaves were nearly gone, and rain had pressed the remaining ones flat against the pavement. I turned on the desk lamp. The lake plan folder stood upright in the cabinet beside my desk. I took it out. Inside were printed bank statements, inspection photographs, the purchase agreement, estimates for electrical work, and a hand-drawn plan for converting the small second bedroom into Elise's studio. She had begun painting during the pandemic, mostly landscapes, water, trees, empty roads. She said the cottage would give her room to work. I ran my finger along the pencil line where I had marked a north-facing window. Then I opened the contract. There were 2 places where Elise's name appeared. One was in the intended vesting instructions. The second was in a note from the solicitor indicating that final ownership could be amended before closing. The deposit had been paid from an account in my name. The savings account Elise and I called the Lake Fund was technically joint, but I had not used it. 3 months earlier, after receiving an inheritance from my grandfather, I moved the deposit from my separate account because I wanted the joint savings to remain untouched for renovations. Elise knew about the inheritance. She believed most of it remained invested. She did not know I had used part of it to secure the cottage. That was not a hidden advantage I had designed. It was simply an unfinished surprise. At 10:03, I emailed my solicitor, Marianne Holt. I wrote that I needed to revise the vesting instructions before the noon appointment. I asked that title be placed in my name only. I read the email 3 times. Then I added 1 sentence. Please also prepare an option for assigning the property to the Harland Residential Trust, if that offers a cleaner structure. I sent it. My hands were no longer cold. At 10:11, I opened the Lake Plan spreadsheet. The first tab was labeled Purchase. The second was Renovation. The 12th was labeled Someday. Elise had named that tab. It contained no numbers, only a list. Morning swims, 2 bicycles, a long table on the porch, a dog when we stopped traveling so much, Christmas by the lake, grow tomatoes, stay for a full month. I read each line, then I saved a copy of the file and removed Elise's editing access. I did not delete the list. I changed the name of the tab from Someday to Original Notes. At 10:28, my phone rang. Elise. I let it ring until it stopped. A minute later, she called again. I answered. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I could hear movement around her. A car door. Wind. The distant swish of tires on wet road. She asked where I was. I said, at work. She asked why. I said, I had something to take care of. Her breathing changed. She asked what. I looked at the wrapped key on my desk. I said, "Future plans." She was silent. Then she said she was on her way home. I asked whether she was alone. She said yes. I did not know whether that was true. I said I would be home later. She asked me not to shut her out. I said, "Elise, you left our anniversary dinner for another man." She began to speak, then stopped. I said, "I am not shutting you out. I am accepting where you went." She said it was not that simple. I said, "It does not need to be simple tonight." Then I ended the call. At 10:47, I placed the cottage key beside the restaurant receipt on my desk. The silver surface reflected the yellow desk lamp. Two small objects. One represented a dinner I had paid for after my wife left. The other represented a future she had assumed would wait. I photographed them together, not for evidence, not to send to anyone. I wanted a record of the moment before I changed course. In planning, there is a point known as the decision horizon. Before that point, alternatives remain open. After it, the cost of reversal becomes greater than the cost of continuing. People imagine those horizons as distant. Often, they are only a single signature away. I left the office at 11:26. When I arrived home, every light downstairs was on. Elise sat at the kitchen table, wearing the red dress and no shoes. Her coat lay folded over the back of a chair. A glass of water stood before her, untouched. The clock above the stove showed 11:54. She looked smaller than she had in the restaurant, not less responsible, just more human. Her mascara had smudged beneath one eye. I placed my keys in the ceramic bowl near the door. She asked whether I had changed something. I removed my jacket and hung it in the hall closet. Then I sat across from her. I said yes. She looked toward my empty hands. She asked what I had been planning. I did not answer immediately. The refrigerator motor clicked off, and the house became very quiet. I said I had bought the cottage on Lake Merrow. Her face went still. I told her the address. I told her about the cedar siding, the dock, the maple tree, and the upstairs room with the north-facing window. I told her I had planned to give her the key after dessert. She covered her mouth with one hand. For several seconds, she made no sound. Then she asked whether I had bought it for us. I said, "That was the plan." She began to cry, not dramatically. Her shoulders lowered. Tears moved across her cheeks. She pressed her fingers against her eyes, as though trying to keep something inside. She said she did not know. I said I knew. She said if she had known, she would not have left. That sentence hurt more than the others. I leaned back in the chair. I said, "The cottage should not have been the reason you stayed." She looked at me. I said, "I should have been." She lowered her hand. She said she had been lonely. I asked for how long. She said more than a year. I asked why she had not told me. She said she had tried. I thought back through the previous year. There had been conversations. Not one clear declaration, but several fragments. She said we had become efficient. She said our evenings felt scheduled. She said I solved every problem, except the ones she wanted me to sit beside. At the time, I believed I had listened. Perhaps I had listened the way I listened at work, identifying the issue and moving toward correction. More dinners, a weekend away, earlier evenings. I treated loneliness like a service gap. I did not understand that she wanted grief acknowledged before improvements were proposed. That failure belonged to me. The affair did not. Both things could be true. I said I was sorry she had been lonely with me. Her expression changed, and for a moment, I saw the woman from the library basement, the one who believed people were supposed to listen. She said Julian listened. I nodded. She told me he was a consultant who had been assigned to her firm 8 months earlier. They had spent weeks traveling together for a hospital project. He was separated from his wife. He understood the pressures of her work. He noticed when she was tired. The first time they kissed was in April after a client dinner. 6 months. The number she had chosen at the restaurant. But before that, there had been messages, lunches, long calls from hotel rooms. A relationship does not begin at the first point someone is willing to admit it became physical. It begins when secrecy becomes necessary. I asked whether she loved him. She said she thought she did. I asked whether he loved her. She said yes. I asked why he had been waiting near our anniversary dinner. She looked down. She said he had asked her to leave me that night. The timing was not accidental. Julian knew the date. He knew where we were eating. He had told her that if she stayed through the dinner, she would be choosing comfort over truth. She had objected. He drove there anyway. Then he messaged her from around the corner. He turned our anniversary into a deadline, and she accepted it. I did not know Julian. I did not need to imagine him as evil. He was a man in pain, attached to a woman who had described herself as trapped. He wanted certainty. He created a moment in which she would have to prove what she had told him. She proved it. I asked why she came home. Elise looked toward the dark window above the sink. She said they argued in the car. After she left the restaurant, Julian expected her to come to his apartment. She said she needed time. He said she had already chosen. She told him our marriage deserved more than one abrupt ending in a parked car. He accused her of retreating. She got out at a petrol station and called a taxi. The silver car had not carried her into a new life. It had carried her 12 miles before the uncertainty she had avoided returned. She said, I made a terrible mistake. I looked at her wedding ring. I said, you made a choice. She said she wanted to fix it. I asked which part. She did not answer. The affair, the dinner, the argument with Julian, the possibility that the cottage was no longer hers. Regret often arrives as a crowd of losses, and people call the whole crowd love, because separating the faces is too painful. I told her I had changed the cottage ownership instructions. She asked what that meant. I said her name would not be on the property. She closed her eyes. I told her the joint lake fund remained untouched. Half belonged to her. I would not move it without her agreement. She asked whether I still intended to buy the cottage. I said yes. Her eyes opened. She asked whether I planned to live there alone. I said I did not know yet. That was the truth. I knew only that I would not surrender the property because the future attached to it had changed. For years, I had imagined the cottage as evidence of our shared endurance. Perhaps it could become evidence of mine. Elise reached across the table. Her hand stopped a few inches from mine. She said, please don't decide our whole life tonight. I looked at the place where her fingers rested on the wood. I said, I am not deciding our whole life tonight. Then I added, I am deciding what I will sign tomorrow. She withdrew her hand. We sat in the kitchen until 1:38. She told me more. Not everything. No one tells everything in one night. But enough. There had been hotel rooms in Dunley and Westmere. There had been lunches she described as client meetings. The conference in August had ended one day earlier than she told me. The earrings she wore to our anniversary dinner were the same ones she had worn the first night she slept with him. That detail came out accidentally. She mentioned the hotel mirror, then stopped. I looked at the silver circles beside her face. She removed them, placed them on the table. I did not touch them. At 1:52, I carried a pillow and blanket to the study. Elise stood in the doorway. She asked whether I wanted her to leave. I said not in the middle of the night. She asked whether I hated her. I said no. That seemed to upset her more than anger would have. She said, I don't understand how you can be this calm. I looked around the study. The room was 9 feet by 11. One bookcase, one desk. A narrow sofa we bought second-hand during our first year in the house. I said, calm is not the absence of pain. She waited. I said, it is where I am putting it. She nodded and closed the door. I did not sleep. At 4:17, rain began again. I listened to it strike the window and thought about infrastructure, not roads or utilities, marriage. The visible parts receive the most attention. Anniversaries, houses, vacations, photographs. But the strength lives in systems no one celebrates. Daily honesty, small disclosures, the willingness to disappoint each other in conversation rather than devastate each other in secret. Our marriage had not collapsed at Bellwether House. The dinner was only where the failure became visible. At 6:40, I showered and dressed for work. Elise was in the kitchen making coffee. She had changed into gray trousers and a sweater. Her face was washed clean. She handed me a mug. I accepted it. She asked whether I would still go to the solicitor. I said yes. She asked whether she could come. I said no. She looked hurt. I said, "This is not a punishment. The property is no longer a joint decision." She asked whether our marriage was. I said, "For the moment, it is two decisions, mine and yours." She stared into her coffee. Then she said she would end things with Julian. I asked whether she was doing that because she wanted our marriage, or because she was afraid of losing it. She said she did not know. I said, "Then do not promise me anything today." At 8:05, I left the house. Marianne called at 8:22. She had received my email and prepared revised documents. She asked whether I was certain. I said I was certain about the title instructions. She did not ask about the marriage. At noon, I signed the papers. The office was on the third floor of a converted bank building. The conference room windows faced east. A brass clock ticked above a cabinet filled with legal binders. Marianne slid each document toward me and marked the signature lines with yellow tabs. The process took 27 minutes. The cottage became mine at 12:31 p.m. When the final page was complete, Marianne handed me 2 keys on a paper tag. I already had the ceremonial key in the wrapped box. The ones she gave me were newer, cut after the locks were changed. She asked whether I wanted the old vesting draft shredded. I looked at the page bearing both our names. I said yes. The shredder stood in the corner of her office. She fed the paper through without ceremony. The blades pulled our names downward until they became narrow white strips. I felt no satisfaction, only finality. That afternoon, Elise sent a message saying she had ended the relationship with Julian. I replied, "I understand." She asked whether I would come home for dinner. I said I would be home at 7. When I arrived, she had made rosemary chicken, the meal she cooked on our first anniversary. We ate at the kitchen table. Neither of us mentioned the symbolism. For the next 3 weeks, we lived carefully. Elise moved into the guest room. We spoke to a counselor named Dr. Nara Bell every Thursday at 5:30. We divided our joint account. We reviewed the mortgage. We told no one except Elise's sister and my brother. The marriage did not end in one dramatic conversation. It thinned. There were moments when I believed we might repair it. Elise became more honest than she had been in years. She gave me access to her phone without being asked. She stopped traveling for work. She described the affair without making Julian entirely responsible, and without pretending loneliness had forced her into it. She also grieved him, quietly. That was painful to witness, but it was true. Once, after a counseling session, she sat in the car for 20 minutes before coming inside. When she entered, her eyes were red. She said Julian had sent a final email. I asked whether she replied. She said no. Then she said, "I miss the person I thought I was with him." I appreciated the precision. She did not say she missed him. She missed herself, as reflected through his attention. I understood that. I had spent years building a future, partly because I liked the version of myself who could provide it. The cottage closed in December. I visited every Saturday. At first, I told Elise I was inspecting repairs. That was true. I replaced the back steps, hired an electrician, and sealed a leak near the chimney. But I was also learning the place without her. The first morning, I stood in the upstairs bedroom. Snow covered the dock, and the lake had begun to freeze at the edges. The room looked different from the day I imagined her studio there. Smaller, more honest. I removed the pencil sketch from my folder, the one with the north-facing window and built-in storage for canvases. I did not tear it up. I placed it in a drawer. By January, Elise and I knew. Not because the counseling had failed. It succeeded. It helped us speak clearly enough to stop confusing regret with restoration. Elise loved me. I believe that. But she no longer trusted the life we had built to make her feel alive. I loved her, but I no longer trusted her uncertainty enough to attach my future to it. At our 9th counseling session, Dr. Bell asked what each of us wanted if fear were removed from the answer. Elise cried. Then she said she wanted to know who she was outside our marriage. I said I wanted a life that did not require me to wonder whether being chosen depended on what I was about to provide. We sat with that. No one argued. At home, we opened the Lake Fund. It held $131,608. We divided it equally. Elise used part of her share to rent an apartment near Vale and Heron. I used mine to replace the cottage wiring and repair the roof. She moved out on February 3. The temperature was -4 degrees. Her sister arrived with a blue van at 9:15. I helped carry boxes. The last item Elise removed was a framed photograph from our Lake Merrow holiday. We were standing on the warped dock, both laughing because one of my shoes had slipped into the water. She held the frame against her coat. She asked whether I wanted it. I said she could take it. She looked toward the empty place on the wall. Then she said, "I am sorry about the anniversary." I knew she meant more than the dinner. I said, "I know." She waited beside the front door. For a moment I thought she might ask again why I had not fought for her. She did not. She placed the house key in the ceramic bowl. Then she left. Our divorce was finalized in September. It was quiet. No disputed assets. No accusations entered into legal documents. No effort to convert private grief into public blame. Elise kept the Harlan Street house. I could have insisted it be sold, but the equity division allowed me to take a larger share of our investments instead. She loved the garden. I no longer wanted the rooms. I moved to the cottage permanently in October, almost 1 year after the dinner. The first night, I unpacked 6 boxes. I assembled a bed. I placed 2 mugs in the kitchen cabinet, though I lived alone. At 7:32 p.m., the exact time of our anniversary reservation, I sat on the porch with a bowl of soup. The lake was dark. A light burned across the water at a neighboring house. My phone vibrated once. A message from Elise. She had remembered the date. She wrote that she hoped I was well. I looked through the screen door at the kitchen table. The wrapped box lay there. I had kept it for a year. The blue ribbon had loosened, and one corner of the cream paper was bent. I carried it outside and sat down again. For the first time, I opened it. The original silver key rested inside on a bed of white cotton. It no longer opened anything. The locks had been replaced at closing. I held it in my palm. Then I replied to Elise. I said, "I am. Nothing more." She responded a few minutes later. "I'm glad." That was the last message we exchanged for several months. I did not throw away the key. I walked down to the dock. The boards were cold beneath my bare feet. Wind moved across the lake in low ripples, breaking the reflection of the moon into fragments. At the end of the dock, I placed the silver key on the flat wooden post beside me. I thought about the dinner bill folded in my wallet, $212.40, the price of the last meal we began as husband and wife. For a while, I had imagined that paying the bill meant I had been left with the cost of her choice, but that was not quite true. I paid because I had ordered the dinner. I changed the future because I was the one still responsible for living it. Behind me, the cottage windows glowed amber through the trees. The upstairs room with the north-facing window was no longer going to be a painting studio. I had turned it into a reading room. 1 chair, 1 lamp. No plan for the second chair yet. I stood at the end of the dock until the cold reached my ankles. Then I picked up the key and walked back toward the house. The screen door closed behind me with the same sharp wooden sound I had heard on my first visit. In the kitchen, I placed the key in a small drawer beneath the cutlery tray. Not displayed, not discarded, simply put away. Outside, the lake settled into darkness. Inside, the plans were mine to make.